It was many years ago at this point that I had gone through the drive-through of a McDonald's to get some coffee. There was nothing else around, and I needed the caffeine hit. And reflecting upon that coffee, many years later, I realized, huh, that coffee is 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons. Hey, I'm James, and I don't drink coffee anymore because of irritable bowel syndrome. But I'm here to talk about Dungeons and Designs on Crumbling Keeps, the Dungeon Dorks, and also give out too much personal information. So, like I said, I don't drink coffee anymore. I just can't handle it. Smells fantastic. I miss it, but it's not worth the 20 minutes after the cup. What happens? I'll spare you the gory details. But there was a time that I really liked coffee, and that was back when I was living in Portland, Oregon, and the options there were amazing. And because I was insufferable, I would explore those options as much as possible, going to the places that roasted their own beans, that knew exactly where every bean came from. There was some really good coffee on some really rainy mornings. So when I had that McDonald's coffee many years ago, I wouldn't call it good. I've never called it good. But it was the most inoffensive cup of coffee I ever had. There weren't very many rough edges to it. I feel like almost anyone who drank coffee could have drank that coffee and been okay with it. Do you see where I'm going? There were a lot of places that made coffee I liked better, that had distinct things I liked about them, but this was perhaps the most universally accepted cup of coffee one could make. There's like a theory in creating a company or products or marketing or whatever, and it's been a while since I read the official thing, but it's kind of stuck in my head. Where when you first start, your job is to be abrasive, make something that not everyone will want, because you're not going to take that attention away from the big guys. You're not going to say out McDonald's. So you need to make something a few people will like and go from there. If we look at the success story of Starbucks, again with the coffee, they did this very well, no matter what your opinions of them may be. And I do have some big opinions on them, but they did this well. When they first started, they wanted to create an upscale coffee experience. Their coffee wasn't for everybody. It was for people who wanted to also be insufferable about coffee. And they did wonders with their branding. That's why you can't get a small, medium, or large, and you have to get a venti or whatever else at Starbucks. Because they were creating an experience that wasn't for everybody. And if you were to go to a Starbucks 10 years ago versus now, it would be a different experience because they got that market share. But once you get that market share and you have your foothold in the door, how do you go farther if your product isn't for everybody? You start making it for everybody. And so now Starbucks is more along the lines of maybe a slightly fancier Dunkin' Donuts. Maybe. They don't have the exclusivity that it once did. So these products go from something with a vision, something distinct, to something more universal. If you haven't guessed where my tie-in with this is now, it's 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons. D&D has been around for a very long time at this point. About, what, 5 decades? They just had their 50th anniversary not too terribly long ago. And during that time, they have made a game that is more accessible. And there's benefits to that. I mean, in some ways more accessible, but we'll get to that in just a little bit. But here's the thing about Dungeons and Dragons is I think there are many games that do Dungeons and Dragons better than 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons. See, the thing I think is that 5e, you can do anything in it, and it's kind of a strength, but in my mind, it's also a weakness because it does all the things, it just doesn't do any of them as well as others who specialize. It's like that cup of coffee. 5e may not be the best edition of Dungeons and Dragons, but it's the least offensive. And I don't mean that in a social way. I mean that mechanically and everything else. The rough edges have been filed away so that it's real smooth going in. Think of it kind of like having a multi-tool, right? One of those little things you fold open and it's a small pair of pliers and there's a knife inside and a little screwdriver, etc. You can do a lot of things with it. But if you have a full toolbox, you would much rather bring out that regular screwdriver and your vice grips and all the things that you don't have to make do to do the job. They're designed specifically for it. Sure, the multi-tool will work. It's great to have in a pinch. But if you're getting serious about it, it's nice to have the right tools for the job. And so strangely, even though 5e is perhaps the most accessible Dungeons and Dragons, I don't think it's the best for beginners. So this episode, I want to talk about Dungeons and Dragons that do Dungeons and Dragons better than Dungeons and Dragons, even if they're not actually Dungeons and Dragons. Say that 5 times fast, and then stop. You're embarrassing yourself, and you're probably in public. So these games are Dungeons and Dragons like. The mechanics will feel familiar to people who have played Dungeons and Dragons. It's not enough that they're just fantasy, but mechanically, they feel similar. You could trace a route from them back to D&D. And the place I want to start is the place I think people should begin. So, I'm a professional dungeon master as well as a publisher, podcaster, etc. And the game I get approached the most about to teach new players is 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons. Because it has that name recognition, just like McDonald's and their coffee. And I'll try often to convince them to start with a different game because I don't think 5th edition is the way to go with beginners. There's a lot to learn. And even if they do decide like they want to stay with 5e, I'll try and suggest, hey, let's do some pre-built characters first. And then when you go to build your actual characters, you'll know what the numbers do. We'll do a little one-shot before getting into the main campaign. And some folks take me up on that, thankfully, because it's hard to know what dexterity and constitution mean in-game before you ever play a session. So I think that's one of the easiest ways to learn. But if I had my way, I start people out on Mouse Ritter. Mouse Ritter is a brilliant little D&D-esque game where you play mice in a big world. Think Redwall or The Secret of Nim. Rats are bad, mice are good. Beware of the cat. It has a few things going really well for it. First off, the mechanics are really simple. There's not a lot of player powers, or rather character powers and abilities, which means that powers and abilities aren't restricted to a single type of mouse or anything like that. Anyone can try and sneak. Anyone, if they have the right tools for it, can cast magic. The inventory system is great, especially for new players and especially for younger players, though I will say, Mouse Ritter is still a great game for adults to learn as well, even if the themes seem childish. So the inventory on your character sheet, you have a bunch of boxes. And the things that you can carry are actually little cutout cardboard chits that fit in those boxes. And so it makes inventory management both tactile and fun. You're not adding up weight based encumbrance, which is terrible. And it takes it even a step farther than the normal slot based encumbrance with the way that it's tactile and you move the actual physical things into your inventory. Character sheets take up half a sheet of paper at most, so there's not a lot to learn. You can really get up and moving, and there's not a lot of times in the game where you have to stop and say, like, well, it doesn't work that way in the rules. It's very freeform, very story driven, and it isn't old school, like, it is an OSR type game in the way that it's governed a lot by rulings at the table. But since there's not a lot of rules to interface with, that's not a daunting thing to do. You can just make things up on the fly and not have to worry about contradicting 500 pages of rules. So that's for beginners, but what about folks who are, well, maybe advanced? What about the folks who love building characters, and not just for the backstory? They love interfacing with mechanics in a strategic way. They love character builds. They love to do as much damage as possible in a single hit. They like to try and break the game. Not my style of play. But it is a style of play that is well supported, especially by Pathfinder. If you know of D&D and you've been playing for any amount of time, I feel like Pathfinder is the game you have most likely to hear about. It branched off from 3rd edition Dungeons and Dragons. It's complicated. There are tons of character options. So if character options are a thing you enjoy, Pathfinder is a great game for you. You can plan out your character advancement in advance. And you can make some truly disgusting characters that can do truly ridiculous things. But because of the way the mechanics interface with it, I feel that story suffers a bit. Going through their adventure paths, I haven't looked at many, I will be honest. But they seem to be kind of railroady. But then again, that's really not that much different than a lot of the 5e stuff. But that's because in Pathfinder, it's not about that. It's about interfacing with the mechanics in a very certain way. Things are done very specifically, in that there's not a lot of room for ruling over rules. The GM doesn't have to make a lot of decisions. The game tells you exactly how hiding is done. It tells you how social things are done. There are very intricate subsystems because it doesn't want you to mess this up. So in a way, I expect Pathfinder games for folks actually following the rules as written to be one of the most homogenous play experiences out there. And that from one table to the next, it's going to feel the same. So if you like character building and maximizing damage or just getting sick character builds, Pathfinder's going to be a good way to go. Now, the next category is something I think 5e actually does pretty well, and that is long story driven fantasy campaigns. But I do want to offer an alternative, and that I really hope I get some feedback on this, good or bad, because I want to know what people think, is 2nd edition Dungeons and Dragons, which is what I started out playing. This was my first edition I ever played. So I didn't have a lot of context for it at the time in what came earlier and how it changed things. But once you got to 2e, it started being not as deadly as, say, basic Dungeons and Dragons. And 2e, the full name is Advanced Dungeons and Dragons 2nd Edition. It still existed as there was a basic Dungeons and Dragons still out. Before it got to 3rd, and then there was just 3rd Edition, and it kind of did away with the 2 different branches, but we won't get too much more into that. Anyway, there's a lot of character options in 2e, at least for the time, more than, say, basic. The character kits were great. That was kind of like the first introduction of subclasses, but they did function a bit differently. But there's tons of thematic content out there. One of the things people like to complain about 2e is the number of splat books out there. They just really got into the world building of Dungeons and Dragons, and a lot of the things that exist in 5e as far as canon came about in 2E because before that, canon wasn't really a thing for Dungeons and Dragons. And even in 2E, it was kind of loosey goosey. It gave you campaign worlds, but largely you were expected to kind of build your own. And I feel that's something that doesn't happen as much anymore. Like, you didn't have to say homebrew world back when you were playing 2E because that was mostly just kind of expected. And 2E was when Spelljammer and also Planescape came out. And these were the first two campaign settings that kind of connected the campaign settings. So suddenly things were starting to become kind of more homogenous. But that's neither here nor there. But yeah, there's a lot of thematic content out for it, especially for characters. And there's an emphasis on the fiction of like your character builds, even though there were a good deal of options, the emphasis was kind of on the fiction rather than strategic game balance. Like if you have the complete book of elves, you could make a completely broken character. But that kind of wasn't the point. The point was to be like, oh, elves are cool. I'm going to use this book, you know? And again, I'd love to hear feedback on this, even if it's trash talk. So, what about like old school style exploration or gonzo Dungeons and Dragons? Like the science fantasy type of stuff? Well, old school essentials is kind of a shoe-in, which is just a copy of basic Dungeons and Dragons from back in the 80s. The system is simple, there's not a lot to do there, but the strength in it is in the dungeons and adventures out there. There is a bunch of gonzo type dungeons and wacky stuff, but there's also a lot of other things too. Like the strength in that edition are what people are doing with the adventures and supplemental material to this day. I think it's because it has one of the strongest design ethos that even today people are still talking about what is old school play, but it gives a set of guidelines. And I think because of that, it actually fosters a lot of ingenuity. It's kind of like if you only have three ingredients to cook with for your entire life, you're going to get really creative with them and create some of the greatest cuisines out there. Of course, that is an exaggeration. Now, what if you want to sit in your basement and listen to heavy metal and play Dungeons and Dragons? Mork Borg. It's bleak, it's deadly. The book itself is an assault on the senses. It is by far the death metal of D&D. It also has a great third-party community. There's a lot of third-party stuff out there for it as well. Even if you don't play it, it's honestly really fun to read. I've rarely played Mork Borg, but I really enjoy the supplements. But it does tend toward a deadly style of play. Your characters don't have a lot of padding, but it also doesn't take long to make a new character. So it's kind of fun to have them die and cycle through it. It is not a game where you want to write 10 pages of backstory for your character because it really won't help them. There's a line somewhere in there along the lines of you can name your character, it won't matter, they'll probably die anyway, or something like that. If you haven't heard of it, definitely worth checking out. Now, what if you really enjoy like tactical, grid-based combat? Well, 5e is okay for that. But the king? 4th edition Dungeons and Dragons. And again, I'm wondering what kind of feedback I'll get on this. I think it's the edition of D&D that feels the least like D&D. And if it was under a different name, I think I'd be hesitant to include it on this list of Dungeons and Dragons-ish games to play Dungeons and Dragons with. But because it officially was a version of Dungeons and Dragons, here we are. It was the first edition that really felt inspired by MMOs instead of the reverse. It is very grid based. There are like characters had for the first time, and it was written in the text different roles. Controller, I don't remember what they're called because I never cared. Damage dealer, the one that does a bunch of damage, the one that is a tank that to suck up the damage. And you were encouraged to build parties with this in mind. One thing I did like is they had what were they called? Just basically goblins and horde enemies that only had one hit point. You just had to hit them once and they were dead. So it did feel kind of cool to be wading through hordes of monsters, and then there were just some were more important than others. But yeah, If you want some very strategic grid-based combat, it's a good game to go with, and it's why other games have appropriated that for very different themes. I know there's mech games out there that have used it, and I just can't remember they are. Okay, so finally, if you've been playing 5th edition and you are interested in other games, but the idea of learning a new system is really intimidating for you, what should you go for? My best 5th edition rehab game is Shadow Dark. Now, there's a lot of great things about it on its own merit, but it feels more 5e than any of these ones I've suggested before, but steeped in like an old school ethos. You're probably going to die more often. Exploration is more important and I dare say more exciting than in 5e. And with the Kickstarter they just did and the things they have coming out, I think they have some really fun things coming up, especially for like hex crawls, things that D&D doesn't, 5th edition that it just doesn't utilize that much. And I do enjoy the torches are important and you have to track them, but you set a real world timer of an hour to do so. But it has things like rolling at advantage and disadvantage, and you roll a d20 and you add your modifiers. It feels like 5e, but less. There's a lot less to have to keep track of, and a lot less to learn. And again, as far as like introducing new players to the game, this would be on a list too. I think Mouse Ritter is still easier and more fun for that, but I think Shadow Dark would be definitely in the running. Well, this turned out longer than I thought it would. But if you want a D&D with other D&Ds that D&D better than D&D, this is a great list of games that I think you should try. I've played them all and I've enjoyed all of them to varying degrees, and I'm happy to answer questions about them. If you have thoughts about any of these, please leave me a message at crumblingkeep.com/question because I'd love to hear what you think. And if you love 5th edition, there's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes you just gotta drink coffee for the caffeine it provides. Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you have any questions about anything I talked about here today or on any past episodes of Dungeon Dorks, go to crumblingkeep.com/question and ask away, or just check the link in the show notes.